Welcome to this webinar on the ACCA's audit examiner report. So it always gleans a lot of information from it, where these are lots of typical things that we've seen before in other exams. And this one exactly really shows what a classic ACCA audit exam looks like. And I'm going to go through all the details of each question, not necessarily all the answers to give you all that, because I think you can look through that yourself and use it as something you can test yourselves later to go through the full exam, because you have that examiner report, which is more detailed than you would typically get on any other question. And then I'll go through the bits to point out stuff that you really need to kind of take note of. And hopefully that kind of helps you in your question practice going forward. So looking at our lovely screen over here. Voila. So when we start looking at this, okay, we start to see that kind of front page, which there's nothing really interesting on it. And as we move through, and I've deleted a couple of sections just to make this nice and simple for you. As we start to move through it, just a couple of things to note that you may not know already. The first one being, this is only a variant of the exam. So if you sat this exam and you didn't pass it, you might notice the questions are slightly different to what you've seen before. But just in case this is your first exam where you didn't know this is a variant of the exam. So there are several other variants. The second thing is this covers 2 sittings. So that means that it's had multiple variants of multiple sittings. So this covers the December and September 2025 sittings. So there's several exams all mashed up into one here, and they're just giving you an example of one of those exams and breaking that down. Second thing is pass rate on this was 46%. Now, for at this level, that's a pretty good pass rate. Only SBL normally kind of tops that. So what that tells me is this was a more classic exam where students did pretty well, whereas their pass rate would normally be at a kind of low 40s, I'd say, sometimes 40% for this kind of AA level. So again, that's worth noting that this isn't an easier exam, because there's never an easier exam. It's just that it kind of sat a bit nicely with students, and there's some areas that sometimes get exposed a little bit more that students struggle with. But no doubt there is some tricky stuff in here. So if we first look at the multiple choice questions, there's nothing really that students can't really achieve on these first few questions, because it's very, very classic. Multiple choice ones in recent years have been weakening and weakening, okay, meaning students have been really struggling with some of the practical details. This one isn't really going into the nitty gritty of it. It's very much staying from that. You need to know that a forecast, so when we're looking at this, some kind of forecast that they might be doing is something that they can't really gain that really high, reasonable level of assurance that an audit does. Whereas something like this, limited assurance, okay, it's a negative opinion, meaning we couldn't find anything that suggests it's wrong. So nothing came to our attention is the wording for it. And so as you start looking through this, it's actually more about the 5-year forecast that we can see that's been gleaned here, and also a bit about the responsibilities or rights and responsibilities of auditors. Now, it's not a very interesting part of it, the rights and responsibilities. You know, we have to kind of learn and show that. We always accept that. But the 5-year profit forecast is something that it's one of those assurance engagements that does pop up every so often. And the content behind it is actually quite nice. Okay, so limited assurance, it's a negative opinion, it's a low or a moderate level of evidence still, because they have to give some kind of reassurance about it, but it's a forecast. So there's only so much reassurance you can give about forecast. And so that's where we have all this stuff working through. Okay, so the external audit, remember, is the one that does not fall into this remit, but 95, if not 100% of your exam will be about an external audit or a statutory audit. So that's the first bit to know. I'm not going to go through all the detail of each question, but the first thing to know is about their rights and responsibilities, which is quite a nice question. The overall framework, the review, okay, and the elements of an insurance engagement, which that could on its own be a 5-mark question. Okay, there's 5 elements to that assurance engagement that you need to know about. They are only a couple of them have been listed here. Okay, but they are, again, fairly common questions that can pop up, but it could even be a 5-mark question. So same with if you're looking at the elements of the internal control environment, that's also potentially a 5-mark question. So very much heavy on knowledge. Again, a nice question about forecasts. The bit where I really want to talk to you about is this question when we start getting into procedures. Now, procedures can cause some real headaches for students. Okay. So when we start looking at procedures, you need to start thinking about what ones are substantive. Okay. Because when they say procedures, they generally mean substantive tests or proper audit tests, we call them. Okay. So we don't mean a controls test. Okay. A test of controls is to get some reassurance about, if I was putting in my debits and credits in the finance system as the finance person, could I put one that's 100 and one that's 1,000 and it goes through? That's what I'm looking for, because that would cause me a real headache as an auditor. So when we're looking at tests of controls, that shouldn't be in this section. Okay. So we already know that that one's straight out. Okay. Because tests of control shouldn't really be done. And particular, we wouldn't necessarily do them when we're looking at a forecast. We wouldn't necessarily do that anyway, because our main focus is on we're going to test, did all the numbers that go into this actually seem like they're okay, because it's a forecast, so we might not be able to validate that some of it is actually accurate. Okay, we can just get some level of reassurance that it is. So that's the first one. The second thing to note, which I think is quite true for a lot of exam reports, these are not written as full audit tests. So just be clear that even though the examiner's written these as these are the procedures, if you wrote them in your exam, I would not expect you to get a 1 mark answer, because this does not tell me why. Okay. So absolutely critical behind this is none of this tells me why they're testing it. So agreeing a sample of revenue and expenses to invoices to confirm they are accurate. That's your why. So if you don't do that, you're only ever going to get half a mark. And as you go up high level, you're going to get 0 marks. Okay. So that's the one thing to note across this is these are not full audit tests. They are just telling you what the test itself was, not why they're doing the test. As we said, as we look in the detail, agreeing a sample of revenue expenses to invoices, well, this is a forecast. So one, we might not even have them. So it's probably unlikely we would be able to do that. But in particular, what they talk about in the syllabus is it's really common for us to do analytical procedures. Now, analytical procedures is just our audit fancy way of saying things like we're going to do some ratios, or we're going to compare what we think it should be to what it actually is. Okay. So when we're looking at this, so maybe last year and the year before that, they've grown by 10%. Yet the first year in the forecast is 400% growth. That's a bit weird. Okay. So if we pick stuff up like that, then that's our significant movements in forecast revenue. And that's the same with comparing forecast revenue to prior years. We're starting to see that. What do we expect? So for example, if they increase the price, then we'd expect revenue overall potentially to go up by that increase in price. Okay. Ignoring volume, but it's those kind of things where we should see that built in. And hence why that one and that one are getting the marks. Okay. So agreeing a sample revenue to and expenses to invoices, as I said, this is a forecast. So they probably won't have them. Whereas if this was interim work, then maybe we'd start looking at that. But it is coming back to in a assurance engagement, so a forecast and so on, we don't typically do too many or too much detailed testing. We do a lot of analytical procedures, a lot of discussions. But in reality, if you were writing a test, particularly when you get to strategic level, if you're writing a test about this, then I would still be chucking in loads of proper audit tests. Okay, so recalculating this and that. So hopefully that gives you a good bit of grounding in these multiple choice ones. But as I said, that was quite a nice set of multiple choice ones, I think, overall. So if you failed, obviously you're not going to feel that way. But particularly these are really like ground basics. Okay. So we'll dig into this test bit a bit more later. As we go into the long form questions, okay, the long form questions, there's a 30 marker, 20 markers that we typically see. Again, this is pure classic ACCA audit, right? So there's always an internal controls question, and there's always an audit risk question, okay, and it's going to dominate it. They like to put knowledge questions around it. So 3, 4, 5 marks, knowledge questions around it, just to build it up. Okay. But the chunky bit in the middle, okay, usually is maybe it's a 10, 15, 16 mark question on control weaknesses and a 10, 15, 16 mark question on audit risk, something like that. Okay. usually even marks. But they said they like to build it, keep it fairly similar topic. So explaining why the auditor obtains an understanding of controls and the methods. Well, internal controls is about saying, you know what, can I even rely on the outputs? So I mentioned earlier about could I put in a debit but not even a credit? I'd be really concerned about that as an auditor because that means everything in the trial balance should be way off. Okay. So it's those kind of things that I'm concerned about. So that's why I'm testing who can amend payroll, who can test, who can pay payroll. Those kind of things are the controls because they're focused on the process. So I want to do it to get reassurance. It will affect the level of testing I do. Okay. It's a requirement for us to do that as well as part of our ISAs. So there's a lot of reasons why we do it. And so the methods are classics. So questionnaires, writing basically like an essay down, okay, or narrative flowcharts, all that kind of stuff. But I said the big bit I'm going to cover in a separate video is internal control questions. Okay, they are so common. Okay, deficiencies is our most classic one. The bit that people struggle with a little bit more, okay, is number one, explain the deficiencies, because you can see in a question if it says they don't do this, you're like, well, that's a little bit dodgy, so it's probably not good. But when we see recommending control, it is also describing a control. So if you see someone say they don't review this before it gets paid, you don't say review it before it gets paid because you're not going to get a mark for that. Okay. We know if we're kind of, it feels a bit too easy, it's probably too easy. But then when we get to this test of control, this is now your audit hat. And this is questions where the auditors like that bit of it, but everyone else generally likes the rest of it. Okay. So again, focusing on that little bit there. So if we can do that, then great. I said I'll cover that in a separate video to go through all the details. But this is the very, very classic question that we start looking at. Okay, very, very classic. As we then move to our middle kind of long form question, said there's a bit on substantive, which comes up very often, and it is such a struggle. So I'll cover this in a separate video, but substantive tests or substantive procedures or audit tests, as whatever you like to call them, they are really polarized. Okay. Anyone that does an audit sometimes struggles with it, but anyone that doesn't work in audit, which is to reassure you, about 80% of people who do this ACCA qualification, that's a real big problem for getting full marks on, let alone even half marks on it. So I'm going to have to do some detailed work on other videos to follow along with that. So as I said, one thing that pops up every so often is corporate governance. Okay, so corporate governance is really about the protecting the shareholders, protecting the business. Okay, so occasionally they do pop up with a written question around this. Okay, so remember things like there should be non-executives, they should be independent, there should be at least an equal amount of non-execs to executive directors. So chief exec then has a chair that's the non-exec. Okay, so it's all those things that we're looking at. Okay, and then as we are then moving towards I said this middle question, we get this big audit risk bit. Okay, so big audit risk bit, which is documenting our audit work. Now, purposes of audit work, people would struggle more on that. Okay, because they're like, oh, because we have to. It's like, yeah, we do have to, but you need to explain kind of why is that the case. So it's not just what is in the audit work that's documented, which can be its own question. Okay, it's also the why we do that. So it's a legal requirement, particularly, for example, in the UK. Otherwise, how would we know? Now, it doesn't state how you document that. It just says there should be some evidence about what you actually obtained as evidence, because you need to potentially be reviewed by let's say in the UK, the FRC, or maybe even ACCA would do an inspection of an audit firm's work. Okay, if let's say they're unlisted, then in that case, for own training purposes would be outside of that. So lots of reasons why, legal reasons, training reasons. Okay, for the fact that someone's got to review it. Okay, if a junior person came to me and said, "Oh, I tested all those expenses," I was like, "Okay, where's the evidence?" And they go, "Oh, I didn't collect any." How am I going to sign that off as a manager? Okay, so it's all those things about quality that come into play. Ratios, love it. Whenever we get a ratios question, we love it. Okay, because ratios are bread and butter. They are in your financial accounting exam. They're in an AAT exam. Like they're everywhere. Okay, so they are analytical procedures, but they're also just ratios. Okay, so hopefully we'll be all right with them. Okay, and again, drop me a message if you're struggling with that. I'll give you some tips. As we move then to said 7 audit risks, okay. Now these are always focused, okay, and their predominant focus is on financial reporting because it's those core bits. So I recorded a video about what kind of financial reporting could come up in the exam at this level, okay. Because when I talk financial reporting, it sounds more scary than it is. But these audit risks will revolve around what numbers could go wrong. For 95% of cases, it will be a number is incorrect, whether it's under, it's overstated because they've inflated it, or maybe it's a presentational issue, which again, maybe 1 in 10-ish are a presentation issue, like there's a disclosure that's missing or disclosure that's insufficient. So again, we start to look at that. But again, I'll do a whole separate video to cover audit risks because they need like a real focus on how you write them, because it's about explaining what's going wrong. So it's about that structure behind saying this thing means they could have done this wrong, and the outcome of that means that this number is understated or it's overstated. Okay, so it's a guarantee in your exam. So you need to be seeing this as one of the few major questions where you spend a good amount of time on. Okay, so lots of good stuff in here. Again, the typical problems is around people copying, pasting whatever is in the scenario, but they're not actually explaining it. Okay, because if you just copy and paste it, the max you're going to get for any point is half. And now that means you have to have a perfect answer throughout the whole exam to do that. Okay, so it's really, really difficult for people to pass if they just copy and paste and don't explain why it's causing it. Okay, so the point isn't you see something wrong and you copy it and tell the examiner it's wrong. You tell them why it's wrong or why it could be wrong, which is the major cause of that. Okay. So in this case, they had things relating to PPE, okay, that they were looking at. I said it's really, really difficult for if you don't know some of that financial accounting basics, the fact that maybe something should have been a provision because it says in the question it's probable. That's what you need to know. That's the key words, not because, oh, it could be a legal claim. Okay, it's because the question says it's probable. The legal advisors have advised it was probable. So again, really, really common, almost a guarantee for this exam. When it gets a bit more difficult is when you start seeing things like warranty provisions. That's a bit more tricky. Okay, so that's where, say, you buy a washing machine and you get a warranty on it. They don't know how many people are going to claim on it. That's pretty tricky. But the likelihood is it's a liability, so they're probably going to want to keep that number a bit lower than it actually is. Okay, so that's what we're worried about. Okay, but you have to explain why that might be the case. As we move to the final bits of the question, I said, and the final 20 marker, again, this is really starting to distill people, because when you get a question that focuses on audit procedures, we start to have a big problem, okay, where marks drop off really quickly. Okay, so remember I said I'll do a whole separate video on audit tests, okay, and I'll start to dig in lots of things about how you test specific things, especially because lots of you would not have been on a year-end inventory count, okay, and we have to remember is talking about continuous accounts, not even just a one-off, but it's talking about these continuous inventory counts that they're doing. So again, if you're looking to copy and paste inventory tests from another question, they're probably not relevant for him. But we do worry that inventory as an asset is overstated. We worry that they don't have the inventory that they say they do. They sold it before year end and it's actually gone out. But again, remember, when we start to look at this, controls testing is not something, okay, that is part of those substantive audit tests, okay? But we do need to test controls, okay? When we're looking at inventory, we do need to test the controls before we start digging into the substantive stuff, okay? So we need to see that they actually do an inventory count, they record it, they investigate any problems they found in the inventory count, you know, those kind of things. When they have goods that they receive or they dispatch goods, that's a process to deal with that, to take it out of inventory or put it in inventory. That's the kind of things that we're looking at, okay? So we've got to dig into those details to think, how would I then test that? And sometimes they do go into a more practical test, okay? Things like describe the processes you would expect to see in an inventory count. That's a more difficult question, okay, especially if you haven't done one before, okay? But if you've worked in a retail environment, you've probably seen that all the time. Okay, so people put in stuff where the fresh stuff goes at the back and the slightly older stuff goes at the front because they want to make sure they're cycling through that stuff. Okay. So again, More substantive tests. This is the more I see of this, the more I know the marks is likely going to start going down very quickly. Okay. That's why we need a lot of practice. But purchases and expenses is great. We love this. Okay. But again, you have to remember it's about their specific purchase and expenses, not copying and pasting random tests that you see done in different question. So in particular, you might see there's a problem with purchases. It might be that we expect them to be too low, right? Because expenses means it reduces their profits. They're going to want to keep them pretty low. Okay, so we're worried that they bought something and sold it, it's not in purchases, and then think what are the other expenses? So they put purchase and other expenses for a reason. Okay, so it's because people compare purchases to this year and last year. Which ones? Okay, so compare these expenses. What ones are in the question that we're really expecting to look at? Okay. So again, you don't need to state the specific rules. Okay, so it says subject to an accounting standard. It's like some people say IFRS 8 or something like that, and it's like you don't need that detail. You just need to tell me what you're testing, why you're testing it, and I need to be able to think. If I was a new person in a team picking that up, would I actually be able to follow that? So analytical reviews are always on the cards. Okay. So whenever the substantive test, you can start with one of those. But then think about what am I going to test? So if there's VAT or some kind of sales tax, could I recalculate that's been included or not? Okay. So again, you will only get that 1 mark if you say the full test. Okay. Sometimes that takes people longer than a sentence, and that's okay as long as you've got the full test in. Okay. So comparing to prior purchases and investigating any differences with management. Okay, that is the full test. Whereas if you just said compare this year and last year, it will not get you that 1 mark. So again, that's why I say these are difficult things. Okay, sometimes even the examiner writes this stuff, GRNs, and I'm like, GRNs is a shortening. So would they even give you the credit for that? And I do tell my students you have to be a little bit careful with that. So, and then lots of people putting incorrect tests, which again doesn't surprise me at all. So, putting the same things over and over about payables. Well, we didn't really test payables. It asked us for purchases, even though when we test payables, it will overlap with purchases. Okay. And then finally, I said, just to not repeat myself, this is again where I expect it's even more difficult. So directors' bonuses, okay, are something that's likely to be separately presented, separately disclosed. Okay, they're going to be things that are likely to be based on, let's say, profit. That's a classic from the examiner. So again, how can we test things that might mean that they've overstated them? For example, the bonus percentage calculation should be probably in their contract. Let's look at the contract. That's what I'd expect a student's head to think, right, let me look at that contract and see what's actually happened. So that's the kind of thing I'd expect from students, but it's always about how they write it. They struggle with more than generating some of those ideas. Okay. So that's what we're covering. So recalculating the bonus, great. Agreeing the payment to what they said they'd pay. Okay, great. Then also looking at the contracts, which I mentioned, and the disclosure. So that's where, look, that's 4 marks. If those were written as tests, that's the 4 out of 5 that you needed. Boom, you're done. That's 80% in that question. Okay, so that would be beautiful. Right, so lots of stuff in here. Final bit of the question, reporting. Now, they do drop this in just right at the end, okay, whether the financial statements require amendment, okay, which is kind of a financial reporting, a reporting style of question, and 2 procedures to form a conclusion. Again, that's a tricky part of the question. Okay, that's starting to get into the remit of your kind of strategic level. It's more practical than that. So financial statements require amendment is it material? Is it something that could affect the opinion? Okay, but this is really dealing with completion. Okay, in that like I'm going to change my report. So hence events after reporting period split into 2. Okay, subsequent events where we have adjusting ones. That's the real wording we look for. Financial statements requiring adjustment means it must be something that's happened. Okay, where the financial statements could be materially wrong. Therefore, the client should be changing it. Okay. So something that's an adjusting event means it provides more information about something that happened before the year end. Okay. So that means generally if a fire started on the at 12:01, okay, or 00:01 a.m., that's not what started last year. So it's generally that hard cut off. But is it providing more information about something that was in the accounts last year, like a legal claim that's now been settled? Or is there something where a new legal claim has started? That's a very big difference. Okay, so again, That is a tricky question. So if you don't understand the completion part of the syllabus, certainly go back and have you look at notes. Drop me any questions in the comments. Happy to help with this. So hence you can see here, provision, classic, that's the examiner's go-to. Okay, it's material, adjusting event. That's all the wording that I'd expect the student to be bringing into this question. So now, don't get too worried when the examiner mentions this. So overall, multiple choice part of this, they only gave you one example, but that was a classic multiple choice. Really, I'd be really happy that if I was a student. Internal controls question, oh, love it. Audit risk question, love it. Get that real structure down. Substantive test question and completion, that is a difficult question. Okay, so remember this exam typically gives you a controls detailed question, a audit risk question, which is going to be said could be 20, 40 marks in total, those two questions, maybe even 50. Okay, and then the final written question could be on a wide range, but substantive test is also a really common one. Okay, and that typically causes that drop in pass rate when you get to that substantive test question. So I hope that helps. Ask me any questions about the exam report and I'll carry on doing it each time they come out.